All right.
Okay. All right, we'll call to order the tonight's public hearing of the planning board for relative to updates to the Swampscott zoning bylaws.
All right.
I think we need to vote to open the public hearing.
Ethan, I think there's a delay.
Tonight's hearing of the planning board for voice.
Okay.
Good, all right.
Okay,
Nothing like hearing your own voice.
Make a
Yeah,
motion
really.
to open the public hearing.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right,
All in
seconded by Joe, all in favor? Aye, all right. So according to our public hearing notice, the first zoning bylaw for update was an update to zoning bylaw 5.4.0.0, which is site plan special permitting, and eliminating the square footage requirement for new construction, amending the square footage requirement for residential additions by adding language that requires a site plan special permit for all new additions and construction located in the flood zone, and taking any actions relative thereto. So I know at our last meeting, we voted to recommend this with the additions noted in the listing, as mentioned, to require site plan review for any addition in the flood area overlay zone, in addition to eliminating or lowering the requirement for a site plan special permit from 800 to 500 square feet for an addition, and eliminating the requirement of a site plan special permit for new construction of 3,000 square feet, eliminating that entirely, so any new construction will require a site plan special permit and review.
Did we hear anything from the select board? Any comments from them?
Not, I think Doug had a question about the coastal flood criteria for site plan. You were there, Ted. I since reached out to him. I didn't hear back, but.
It was
he
just an
clarified.
inquiry as to the reason why we were doing that. It wasn't
Right.
so much anything other than
Right.
that. And I just explained to him it was to be just another check on the coastal flood area construction, and similar to the updates to the coastal flood area, I'm sorry, the floodplain overlay district, that new construction would be required to submit a narrative onto the resiliency. It was just a further check on any construction in that area, much of which is already outlined in the updates to the flood area overlay district anyway. So he didn't really have a conclusion. It was more of a inquiry,
Right.
I guess.
Right.
Any other inquiries from town staff or other
No,
boards?
at least none that came my way, so.
And I think you had done some inquiries onto the last 2 years of building permits.
Yep,
How many were done in the coastal flood area?
one. Well, actually two. We had 33 Puritan Road and 233 Puritan Road. 233 just came before us for site plan review back in the late fall.
Yep.
Or maybe it was early winter, January. And they came forth, they provided us the floodplain memo, they had the engineers with them. It was a pretty well thought out, robust site plan application. And then 33 Puritan Road was an addition that was applied for last year, and they are located in the coastal flood overlay. And they needed relief before the zoning board of appeals, so they got that, but they were under that 800 square foot threshold for our site plan.
And it was always my opinion that that should have come before planning, simply because of the location
Right,
in the floodplain. And that's when we first kind of had an issue with, well, this is in a flood hazard zone. It says flood hazard, and it doesn't come under the wetlands bylaw, but it wasn't, it doesn't fall under any of those requirements or those restrictions. And the coastal flood area overlay, there were so many sort of conflicting terms. So that was really, honestly, the impetus to make sure
Right.
that our language was in sync with what the state has put forth. And
Exactly.
it just happened to be good timing because the FEMA maps have just been updated. And so now we know, we have new information, and they have become a bit more rigid in terms of floodplain.
right.
So, at this point, that particular site plan at 33 Puritan would have definitely required a site plan.
Right.
And may have had some trouble because of its, because part of that lot is in the
The V
V1 zone.
yeah.
Even though the construction is not in the V1
Right.
zone. So, and that's another different twist that's in the state bylaw that was not in ours. So, yeah, so we've included that floodplain overlay in these site plan regulations.
Right.
Do we say in here anywhere about that we reserve the right to waive any of these requirements?
At least not in the zoning bylaw, but
In the processes, I think we might?
in the rules and regulations,
Okay.
I bet there is, yeah.
So that's what I just would want to check, because I think that we may want that at some point.
Okay,
Even though, like you said, there are very few that came before us, but, you know, I think if there were a case where, you know, something came before you and the building commissioner, and it was, you know, clearly not, you know, we could just sort of look at it and say, well, maybe we don't need to go through this
Right.
process, then we would have, you know, the option to take a look at it and, you know, waive any requirements
Right.
that we might want to do. But, and I do believe that's also in the processes, that we don't
Yep.
need to include it in the bylaw.
Right.
But I just wanted to, in case anyone is listening to this and watching, that there is the consideration that if something were that minor, that would still fall under site plan, we have the opportunity to review it, and we can decide to waive that. But otherwise, I think this will be protective for the town and do a lot of good, and would certainly is in great fairness to neighbors and
Yeah.
everyone else who has
Yeah.
to look at new construction, so.
for sure.
Right, I think even at the 233 Puritan Road, we heard from an abutter
Yep.
with mild concerns, I don't even think concerns is the right word, but inquiries into how the construction there might impact the flooding on their property, if at all.
Right.
So I think having this at least gives an outlet. I mean, that part of town, there's
Exactly.
sensitivities as, being in a flood zone.
Right.
So,
Right.
the second part of the bylaw that Marissa and I were looking into earlier today was the changing from the 800 square foot additions to 500, lowering that trigger. And there were something like 4 building permits between December 2022 and today that would have required site plan that didn't previously. So the effect, well, you know, it affects those 4 building permits, was relatively minimal compared to the overall number of building permits that are issued, which is relatively surprising to me, but important to
Yeah.
note nonetheless.
And I think an important thing to know about that particular restriction is that it's very much in keeping with our peers in other small, densely populated
Right.
communities.
Right.
So, you know, in a lot of our older neighborhoods, or just neighborhoods where their lots are smaller especially, I mean, as we had discussed when we had our initial discussion about this, you know, a 500 square foot addition is really quite meaningful. So I think it's in, you know, it's in all of our interest to pay attention to these things.
And I suppose the third real part of that bylaw amendment is the elimination of the 3,000 square foot requirement, so that any new construction now requires a site plan review. Again, I think there were only 2 in the last 2 years.
Correct.
New construction that were under that 3,000 square foot trigger, 4 that were over it. So the supermajority of new construction, we already reviewed for single-family homes.
Right,
But I know that we had discussed it in the past, how there had been instances where there, you know, the permit may have been pulled and it was slightly lower than 3,000 square feet, but as-built may have been slightly in excess of 3,000 square feet, and things get lost in translation
Right.
from pre-con to post-construction. But I really think that's a good opportunity for us to be able to provide some narrow opportunities for all abutters for new construction to have the chance to kick the tires on what's going on, have an understanding of what the impact is on their property, without being, in my opinion, overly burdensome, since this is pretty narrowly tailored. And new construction is not something for single and two-family homes that we see with great regularity.
right. And I would just like to comment, for the benefit of anyone who is watching or may watch this prior to town meeting, both of the applications that did not require site plan because they were under 800 square feet should have, for a variety of reasons. 3,000 square feet. They both should have, and I'm not going to get into individual properties right here, but we, certainly could if someone was specifically interested in that. Things that people don't think about, of course, there's, a certain right to build a house on a property, but site plan covers so much more than just that. It has to do with, plumbing and electrical, and literally someone had a telephone pole that was moved and it ended up right in front of the neighbor's kitchen window. There are issues here like drainage that are enormously important. Curbs, sidewalks, pitch of a driveway, how many trees someone's allowed to take down, landscaping, sight lines. So this ends up being a really important feature to the pattern of a neighborhood, and especially in a small town like ours, it's very important.
As far as the public hearing goes, I don't think we have any members of the public, well, definitely not in person,
And not online either.
not online. I hate when that
Do
happens.
we vote on anything, or we just?
No, I think we definitely do, because that goes into the warrant. We vote to
Either recommend or
we
not
recommend favorable
action.
action,
Adopted.
right, so that's what we vote to do.
Good.
Also, this will give anyone who isn't going to sit and watch this tonight, but if somebody says before town meeting, the planning board must have had a hearing on this, I want to take a look, then
Right.
they'll be able to look at they'll be able to watch the recording and get a little more information.
Right.
Okay, so we can take them one at a time and vote all at the end, or?
I think we take them each one at a time,
Yeah.
because
Yep.
we'll have to do a different motion for each bylaw update to include in the warrant.
Well, I'll make a motion, if no one else has a comment on this, is
I just
there
have
Joe
one
had
thing
a
that's,
Yes.
I wasn't here at the last meeting, so I'll probably just abstain from this one way or another. I'd have preferred to have seen 800 or maybe even no restrictions on additions. I think I've talked about it in the past. I think it's a small town. It's pretty hard to, I don't know that 500, I think it would have been better if it was tied to something like a percentage of the square footage of the house, but I'm not going to vote against it because of the change. I understand what you're all saying, but, I think you could have some pretty small houses in town where people are trying to, that's what they could afford. They got it, they're locked in, they can't go anywhere else, and 500 square feet might not be enough for them to be able to stay where they want to stay. And I don't know that we always have to come through the planning board process for that.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, but I think that's where the ability to come into town hall and talk about what they're thinking about doing, and having the opportunity to have us decide to waive the requirement and decide that we could perform a review instead of, so that in that case, we can waive the special permit fee, we can waive the whole special permit application per se. They will have to provide, like anything, you have to go to the building inspector and have a set of plans,
Yeah.
obviously, but I think we have that option in site plan under our processes, so without it having to be, with the bylaw written as it is, we are protected per se, but it gives us the flexibility to be able to do that.
Yeah, no,
Which I think
hear
is
your
fair to
position,
people,
yeah.
and I agree
Sure.
with you. I think
Yeah.
there's definitely a possibility there would be cases like that, and I think, it's good that we should have the flexibility to be fair to people.
Sure.
I think to your point, Joe, and I hear what you're saying. I think that's something that, Joe, you've brought up in a number of times where, instead of having concrete boundaries, having to be relative to your property size or lot size may make more sense for the continuous character of the town and of a neighborhood, right? Because 7.5-foot setback in one neighborhood might not make, for one size house, might not make sense for the next neighborhood, even though on paper it is, but a percentage might make sense. Bring that up because that might be something to consider at some point in the future, is looking how to implement something like that, because
I
It's
don't
relative.
disagree, actually. I think the percentage idea is interesting, but the execution of percentage can be very difficult depending on how square footage is distributed. So we might have to be evaluating percentage of footprint
right.
in addition to, and footprint to footprint, square footage to square footage. It does tend to be a complicated formula, if there's a formula on it. But I do think there's value sort of looping back, because I think I'm on the other side of this from you, and we were in the last conversation. Where I really do think, because of the diverse lot size and sort of density of neighborhoods in this town, these reviews are really important because they can impact, like you were talking about the site plan review for a telephone pole being dropped in front of someone's window. It can really impact the neighboring houses. And the role of a planning board, the role of a lot of commissions that are permitting is a way for neighbors to come up with something that works for both the neighborhood and for the house. So I do think it's a valuable thing to have site plan. And again, a 500 square foot is not small. You know, that's not a small addition. And I should have it right in front of me, but this is footprint or square footage?
Square footage.
Any change in the footprint would,
An addition of more than 500
right. It's an
square feet of
area,
gross
square
floor
foot
area.
addition, Right.
Yeah, because I think that's also very complicated because you can have multiple floors
Right.
on
Well,
it. So
there is
that could be this big or it could be,
Yeah.
you know.
You do have setbacks, obviously,
Mhm.
to deal with. I mean, what's interesting about the zoning bylaws is that the whole purpose of it is how do we get to saying yes to something? You know,
Right.
How do we allow?
Mhm.
It's not about no, even though
Right.
sometimes because of the way they're written, it sounds like no. But the goal is to get the right kind of, to help develop a property in the safest way, in the way that's most, the fairest to people that live within, 10 feet of your door, to respect sort of patterns of development. And, we are obviously developing as a town. We continue to see more density come in. And, regardless of what your stance is on that, there's some people that really welcome it and encourage it, and others that are absolutely horrified, and a lot somewhere in the middle. But it's going to happen one way or the other. So to have some kind of guidepost by which we can look and say, okay, let's help you get here with this. But, you can do this, but it needs to look like that. Or, it really is a way of enabling construction. It's not, just turning our back on it at all, which is kind of a bad idea for everyone involved.
And with that in mind too, I do like the idea that this aligns with Marblehead in the sense of the dense neighborhoods. But it also, when you do have alignment between two communities that have as many similarities, it is useful for things not to be overlooked or not to be confused by contractors and architects that are working with,
Right.
with people. So I think that my comfort with it has a lot to do with that number and it being used in Marblehead.
Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, as they say.
There we go.
Well, they have similar patterns where you've got, neighborhoods that are really old and really densely developed and populated. And then you have other areas that are, relatively much newer, where the lot size is much greater. So you've got everything in between.
Right.
And so there isn't a one size fits all. So you've really got to, and, fairness is important, but also, opportunity and kind of scrutiny are both important. And it just finding the right balance, I think. Mostly letting, helping people do what they really would like to do and
Yeah.
doing it well.
Do we have any motions on the floor for this?
I'd be happy to make a motion, only if everyone is finished commenting.
Do we do have
Are there any comments from the
visitor
public?
also.
Anyone who's joining us online, you can use the raise your hand feature, and we're happy to take your comment.
All right. That being said. I
Okay,
don't
that
see
being said, I will move that the planning board vote to recommend favorable action on this article at town meeting.
Is there a second?
Second?
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. All those opposed? None. Opposed?
Abstain.
Abstain. Okay. All right.
Thanks.
So recommending favorable action on amendments to 5400. All right, so the next zoning bylaw that we proposed updates to, at least advertised in the legal notice, was amendments to the zoning bylaw 4110 by renaming the district as the Wetlands Protection Overlay District. And to the extent necessarily, the zoning map as well as further subsection of this bylaw may be amended relative to the change in its name. And amendments to the zoning bylaw 4200 Coastal Flood Area Overlay District by renaming the district as the Flood Area Overlay District, striking language that renders the local bylaw non-compliant, by adding language that brings the local bylaw into compliance with new regulations set forth by the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The zoning map will be further updated to reflect changes in the forthcoming flood rate insurance maps issued by FEMA, to which I believe we received 2 out of the 4 maps.
Yeah,
Ted?
we got 2 out of the 4.
I think you made an error in what you read, just because
Yeah.
it is the floodplain
Floodplain.
overlay district, not the flood area.
Coastal Flood Area Overlay District, right?
Oh, no, we got rid of
Get rid
coastal.
of coastal, it is becoming the floodplain overlay district.
Right.
Floodplain area overlay district.
Okay,
Floodplain-
according to the sheet we have, the
No,
area
it's
is crossed out.
floodplain.
floodplain
Floodplain
overlay
overlay
district.
district, which
Okay.
aligns with the state language.
So the error is just in the legal notice, I guess.
So
Yeah,
now,
I think that was in referencing what was already on paper.
No, it was the second time you read it. that-
Oh, I'm sorry.
I did.
Oh, I hear you.
just,
I hear you, yeah.
um,
By renaming the district.
yeah, but it's not a
as-
floodplain area, that's what's in the notes here. So we could take the
Yeah, it was
area
just,
out.
it was in the legal notice,
Yeah.
but the actual language is floodplain overlay district.
Right, and that's correct on the red line here.
Okay.
Okay. So again, this brings us into compliance with the new state regulations.
Absolutely. Much of this was adopted by the state regulations set forth by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, of which Marissa and Marzi at Town Hall worked with to come up with our local bylaw, mimicking almost all of the language that they had suggested for municipalities in its entirety. Marissa, were there any changes to this that we made that were in addition to any of the example language DCR provided?
No, you mean anything that would be specific to Swampscott that wasn't necessarily,
That wasn't part of this template that DCR provided,
no.
Okay.
Aside from the
Everything-
name,
except for.
right.
Right,
So the DCR works with floodplain overlay district. So we had formerly had like floodplain/wetland protection overlay district, which also then conflated floodplains with wetland protection areas. Not all wetland protection areas are floodplains, and not all floodplains are wetland protection areas. So that was, that became very confusing for the wetland regulation. But it also let a lot of stuff fall through the cracks for coastal flood area.
right.
Right.
So now it's just, anything that floods is in the floodplain overlay district. And wetlands are wetlands. They may flood, they may not flood. They're wetlands. They're a whole separate designation.
Yeah, they're
So-
topographically different, they have 2 different
Right.
sets of regulatory standards.
That's correct. So now anytime you talk about something that floods, unless it's a wetland,
Right.
it's a floodplain.
Right.
So, and these are all marked on the new FEMA maps. There is some language that's a little more strict that comes down from the state in terms of what can be allowed in terms of fill, demolition, what can be built in a VE zone and an AE zone and A zones. It's not that far off from where we were before, but it is a little more rigid, actually.
Right, and requiring any construction to be permitted in the flood overlay district.
Right.
Right,
It
As
does
well as-
allow for variances, but it
does allow for
It has
variances.
to be in like severe cases as usual.
And those variances no longer go to the zoning board of appeals, they go to the state, Massachusetts State Building Code.
Right,
Appeals
which is
board.
really important to know.
Right,
And I also, I just want to make sure that everyone who has to deal with this bylaw, both the building commissioner, planning board, zoning board of appeals, that everyone becomes familiar with the new regulations, because they're definitely different and the process changes. as, you know, our whole coastal flood issues become ever more challenging to deal with.
Are we going to read through all of these, or because they were they were adapted, not? Because I do have a note on page 9.
Okay.
Okay,
In the red line, if the town acquires date, it should actually say if the town acquires data.
Ah,
Is that a good
change
catch? Where is that?
the last page.
Page 9,
14, 13,
first
no?
sentence in the red.
Ah, thank you. Oh, yeah, it is page 9. What do you know? Thank you. Get it? Oh, I missed that one, too. Great.
And I reviewed the new flood maps that we received today. The two that we received didn't seem substantially different than what was on record before, but they were the northern parts of town on the
Right,
Marblehead border.
right.
So probably, I would imagine the parts that are closer to downtown Fisherman's Beach area might be more substantively.
They are, and I think the floodplain around, you know, Phillips Park has gone inland a bit. Certainly over Johnson Park, which
Yeah.
is right on Puritan Road, Sculpin Way, that area. You know, Fish House is
basically
probably
like
a little
Humphrey
further,
Street
little
to
further
the water.
inland, yeah. So, Kings Beach, I didn't see anything that, you know, of course, there, we have cliff, you know, more cliffs there than
Right.
flat land, so it's
Oh,
a,
except down right at the town line.
right,
There's a
so
flood.
there's that. There's
There's that.
Stacy's Brook area, which is, yeah, that's certainly looks worse as
yeah,
well.
yeah, I would expect that to expand.
So, and, you know, I was able to see those online, but I guess they just haven't
They haven't mailed them
They
to us, I
haven't
guess, the only two.
printed out the maps yet. I
Right.
couldn't download it from the online service either, so, yeah, they are kind of ginormous maps, so
Yeah.
Yeah,
probably, I don't have the right program or the right, you know, it's too much data, I suppose. But, so we should be getting the other 2 maps, I'm sure, at some point. And then what do? We just keep them on file in the building inspector's office?
Yeah, building, we'll keep a copy, town clerk will keep a copy, we can give a copy to DPW,
Okay,
yeah.
so.
So the DPW director is now, it's the official floodplain administrator for the town. Marissa, do you recall what that title entails, at least in terms of this bylaw? I'm trying to recall offhand.
I think it would be up to them to make the determination as to whether or not a construction would be subject to these floodplain
Got it.
standards. So they.
again, really increasing his role, his or her role as well.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Right, so we'll have to, bring Gino and our engineer, Mark, to speak on these. as well.
Right, right. Yep,
Any other comments from the board on this
no.
bylaw update?
I think the, you know, the sea level rise estimates are, I don't think that's changed. Did they give us a new table for sea level rise estimates?
No,
Okay, so I think we can just leave that in there. And we put the most recent FEMA maps, the FR, you know, the firm map, flood insurance rate map. And, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't have any questions about it. I'm relieved to have the language cleared up.
Yeah.
yeah.
Excellent.
Want to check online, or?
Any members of the public who wish to comment or ask questions about this proposed bylaw amendment can raise their hand. All right,
If not, I'll make an amendment, motion to adopt, favorable action on the amendment put forth here for the 4.1.00 in the warrant article.
okay.
And 4.2.00, right. Second.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, all right. That's unanimous. All right, the final zoning bylaw amendment was amending Swampscott zoning bylaw 51100 on accessory dwelling units by removing language that renders the local bylaw non-compliant with the provision set forth in 760 CMR and adding language that establishes new regulations regarding the operations of short-term rentals in ADUs. So we talked about this one at length the last several months, but
I have a comment. On 51111, we added the word "a," but that makes it incorrect.
I'm sorry, so 511,
They crossed out the S on entrances.
Yes,
Yeah.
we say maintains a separate entrances, so it's either maintains a separate entrance, but I think.
I think the
Bill,
S is,
The S is crossed
The
out.
S is struck, but it doesn't show very well. If you look carefully, there's a
ah,
line
yes,
through
there is a
the-
line through
through
it.
the S on entrances.
Okay,
There is, yeah.
so don't they need two entrances anyway, or exits?
Separate entrance, either directly.
Because only at least one entrance needs to be separate from the principal dwelling unit, because you can have access, you could enter through the front door of the principal dwelling unit and then go
Okay.
through the kitchen, down a hallway, or down the basement stairs. But one entrance egress needs to be maintained separately.
Okay,
so really the only changes here from what was adopted at 2023 town meeting were to make it compliant with the state law, as mentioned in the public hearing notice, wherein we remove parking requirements for all those ADUs located within 1/2 mile of a transit station, as well as removing the requirement for owner occupancy on the ADU. And then the additional regulation there was prohibiting the rental of an ADU for less than 30 consecutive days, which we were allowed to do by, per the governor's new law there. Otherwise, this is pretty much what we adopted in 2023, just with those minor changes.
I'm just looking under the application requirements. So under C, it says we're required a copy of any recorded relevant special permit. So maybe we want, you see what I'm saying there?
Strike the.
Yeah,
Yep.
when we create a copy of the,
Should be a copy.
Or
of
a
any
copy
report.
of any.
right,
Right, a copy of any recorded.
yeah, any's better. A copy of any recorded, so take out the.
Right.
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
And then transit station, I believe, Marissa, we went through this with the governor's legislation, is any bus stop, whether it's a house or little canopy or not, or the train station, which I think there were only about a dozen
Right.
street addresses in town that fell outside of that 1/2 mile range, maybe
Right.
a little over a dozen.
A couple down in Little's Point, and then a lot, the majority up in Foster's Dam. So,
Yep.
But yeah, I think it was described as or defined as any point where passengers embark or disembark from a mode
Right.
of public transit. So, train station, bus stops, ferry terminals.
Any non-flag stop for a bus.
Right.
Yeah.
Is how it was described at their forum.
And can that be, just out of curiosity, can that be in our town and outside of our town? Okay.
Yep,
I would imagine so, yeah.
yeah.
And it's also important to note that the ADU bylaw does allow ADUs by right, but, still subject to our zoning bylaw setbacks, requirements,
Historic district.
historic district, the size
Right.
of the unit and so forth.
Right.
So,
Right.
okay.
So I think we were ahead of the curve on that one.
Yeah.
in
Or nice.
2023.
It's lucky, yeah. That was made it easier.
Definitely made it easier. I think it was the right decision to kind of update ours to be in compliance with,
Yeah, you're right, and that
MGL.
was, yep, agreed. Although, at first, I didn't agree, but now I do.
I'm glad we persuaded you.
Yeah. Well, I have a bunch of smart guys, so it wasn't hard.
Any comments on this from the other members of the board? No.
Okay.
Any members of the public?
Any members of the public wish to raise their hand to have a comment or question answered? Or in person? All right, seeing none, are there any motions?
I'll make the motion. Make the motion that the planning board vote for favorable action on this warrant article at town meeting.
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right,
To recommend favorable action, sorry, I left out that word.
This is a late time to ask this, but we did make tiny changes in both of these last year that we voted for. Did we need to mention those in the vote?
the administrative changes that we just did?
Yeah.
The striking of the word the, I don't believe we do,
No.
since it's strictly administrative.
Okay.
Yeah, even
Right.
the town clerk has the discretion to make like minor
Perfect.
grammatical changes when
Right.
uploading
Good.
the bylaw.
Typos,
Very
stuff
good.
like that, number of problems and whatnot.
Great.
Yep. Is there a motion to close the public hearing?
So moved?
Second?
Second.
All right, all those in favor, all right? Aye, aye. All right, public hearing is closed. I think that takes care of our